The morning mist clung to the crimson walls of the forbidden city like whispered secrets as Mei Lin knelt before the dragon throne. Her simple servant's robes a stark contrast against the opulent golden dragons that adorned the magnificent hall. The throne room stretched endlessly before her, its vast marble floors polished to mirror-like perfection, reflecting the flickering light of thousands of candles that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Emperor Xuanzong's cold gaze pierced through her trembling form like a blade of ice, his yellow silk robes embroidered with 9 imperial dragons seeming to writhe in the candlelight as if alive with malevolent power. The chief eunuch, his voice echoing through the cavernous chamber with ceremonial gravity, read the charges aloud in classical Chinese that rang with the weight of imperial law. Theft of the imperial phoenix hairpin, an artifact blessed by the ancestors and worth more than 1,000 lives. The accusation hung in the air like incense smoke, suffocating and inescapable, while the assembled courtiers watched with barely concealed fascination at this unexpected drama unfolding in their carefully ordered world. Mei Lin's voice cracked as she proclaimed her innocence, her words seeming to dissolve before reaching the emperor's ears, lost in the vastness of a room designed to diminish the significance of individual human voices. The courtiers whispered among themselves, their silk robes rustling like autumn leaves in a bitter wind, already condemning her with their eyes and calculating how this turn of events might affect their own positions at court. Death by 1,000 cuts. The punishment was announced with ceremonial detachment, as if discussing the weather rather than the brutal end of a young woman's life, the words falling like stones into the silence that followed. From his position among the high-ranking eunuchs, arranged in precise hierarchical order according to decades of imperial protocol, Wei Chen watched the proceedings with practiced composure, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 20 years of service in the imperial palace had taught him to mask his emotions behind an expression of serene indifference, a skill that had kept him alive and influential in a world where showing weakness could mean instant destruction. Yet something about this young servant girl's plight stirred feelings he thought had been cut away along with his manhood in that terrible ceremony of transformation that had granted him access to the inner palace. Her innocence was as clear as morning dew on lotus petals. He had seen enough guilty souls parade before the throne to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and calculated performance. The way she held her head high despite her terror, refusing to grovel or beg in the manner that might have earned her a marginally less horrific death, spoke of an inner strength that reminded him of his younger sister, long dead from plague in their provincial village. The tremor in her voice that spoke of truth rather than deception, the desperate plea in her dark eyes that seemed to call directly to his buried humanity, awakened something in Wei Chen that he had believed forever lost. As the guards moved to escort her to the dungeons beneath the palace, their bronze armor clanking with metallic finality, Wei Chen made a decision that would either redeem his soul or destroy everything he had built through 2 decades of careful maneuvering in the treacherous world of imperial politics. That evening, as the palace settled into its nocturnal rhythm of whispered conspiracies and hidden desires, when the courtyards filled with shadows and the sound of silk slippers on marble pathways, Wei Chen began his clandestine investigation. Using his considerable influence as Chief Inspector of Palace Affairs and his extensive network of informants, cultivated through years of strategic gift-giving and mutual favors, he traced the path of the missing hairpin through the labyrinthine corridors of palace intrigue. The artifact, crafted from pure gold and adorned with pearls from the South China Sea, had vanished during the Moon Festival celebrations 3 nights prior, when the palace had been filled with visiting dignitaries, temporary servants, and the controlled chaos that accompanied any major court celebration. Wei Chen's inquiries led him through perfumed gardens, where concubines shared secrets beneath flowering plum trees, past kitchen chambers where servants gossiped over steaming dumplings while preparing the endless meals required by the palace's thousands of residents, and into the shadowy alcoves where palace guards conducted their private business away from the watchful eyes of their superiors. Each conversation, each carefully placed silver coin, each subtle threat delivered with diplomatic courtesy, revealed another piece of a puzzle that painted an increasingly complex picture of deliberate sabotage. The hairpin hadn't simply been stolen by a desperate servant seeking to escape poverty. It had been deliberately placed in Mei Lin's modest quarters by someone with intimate knowledge of palace routines, access to the inner sanctums, and a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate the imperial justice system. The more he learned, the more convinced Wei Chen became that Mei Lin was not a criminal, but a victim of forces far more dangerous and calculating than simple theft. Wei Chen's investigation soon attracted the attention of Lady Jiang, the emperor's newest concubine, and a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ruthless ambition and her uncanny ability to eliminate rivals before they even realized they were competing. She approached him in the Pavilion of Whispered Secrets, a delicate structure of carved jade and polished wood, where palace residents traditionally conducted conversations that required absolute privacy, her silk robe shimmering like moonlight on water as she moved with the calculated grace of a predator approaching its prey. She offered him a goblet of wine, flavored with jasmine and honey, its sweet aroma carrying poison-sweet implications about the consequences of refusing her hospitality, or more dangerously, her advice. Why does the chief inspector concern himself with the fate of a lowly servant? She inquired, her voice carrying the dangerous melody of a siren's song, each word precisely modulated to convey both innocent curiosity and subtle menace. Wei Chen recognized the threat beneath her courtesy. Lady Jiang was not merely curious, but actively involved in whatever conspiracy had ensnared Mei Lin. And his investigation was treading dangerously close to secrets that powerful people were prepared to kill to protect. Their conversation became a delicate dance of veiled accusations and diplomatic denials, each word carefully chosen to probe the other's knowledge while revealing nothing of their own intentions or the full scope of their discoveries. As she departed, leaving behind the lingering scent of sandalwood and danger that seemed to permeate everything associated with the inner palace's most ambitious women, Wei Chen realized that saving Mei Lin would require him to challenge forces far more powerful and vindictive than he had initially imagined, forces that reached to the very heart of imperial power itself. 3 days before Mei Lin's scheduled execution, when the palace executioners were already sharpening their knives and preparing the bamboo splinters that would make her death as prolonged and agonizing as possible, Wei Chen's investigation uncovered a web of corruption that reached to the highest levels of the imperial court. The phoenix hairpin had been stolen not for its considerable material value, though the gold and pearls could have bought a small estate, but as part of an elaborate scheme to discredit the emperor's most trusted advisors and clear the path for Lady Jiang's faction to seize greater influence over imperial policy. The conspiracy involved at least a dozen high-ranking officials, several wealthy merchants who profited from court contracts, and even some members of the imperial family who had grown tired of waiting for their inheritances. Mei Lin had been chosen as a scapegoat precisely because of her insignificance, a servant whose death would cause no political ripples while serving as a terrifying warning to others who might inadvertently interfere with the conspiracy's carefully laid plans. The real thief was Lin Zhao, Lady Zhang's personal eunuch and a man whose skills at infiltration and deception had been honed during his previous career as an assassin before his capture and forced castration. He had planted the evidence in Mei Lin's quarters with the precision of a master strategist, choosing a moment when she was attending to duties in another part of the palace and ensuring that multiple witnesses would discover the hairpin hidden among her few personal possessions. But proving this truth would require Wei Chen to expose not just a theft, but a treasonous plot that implicated several powerful nobles and threatened the stability of the dynasty itself. Each piece of evidence he gathered brought him closer to the truth and closer to his own destruction, as the conspirators became increasingly aware that their carefully constructed deception was being systematically unraveled by someone with the skills and connections to pose a genuine threat to their success. In the depths of the palace dungeons, where sunlight never penetrated and the air hung thick with the accumulated suffering of countless prisoners who had awaited their fates in these stone chambers, Mei Lin maintained her dignity despite the horrors that awaited her with each passing hour. The underground cells, carved from living rock and secured with iron bars that had turned green with age and moisture, housed the empire's most dangerous criminals alongside political prisoners whose only crime had been to attract the wrong kind of attention from their superiors. Wei Chen visited her under the pretense of conducting final interrogations, bringing with him the authority of his position and carefully crafted documents that gave him legitimate reason to spend hours in private conversation with the condemned woman. In truth, he came to offer whatever comfort he could to a soul facing oblivion, and to learn more about the woman whose fate had become so strangely intertwined with his own sense of honor and justice. She spoke of her childhood in a small village, where her father had been a respected scholar who taught her to read and write when such education was considered wasted on daughters, of her dreams to serve the empire with honor and perhaps earn enough to send money home to her aging parents, of her acceptance of death if it meant protecting some greater truth from being buried alongside her body. Her courage in the face of injustice moved Wei Chen more deeply than any poetry or philosophy he had encountered in his years of study at the Imperial Academy, reminding him of the essential nobility that could exist in the humblest circumstances. During these clandestine meetings, conducted in whispers while guards waited outside the cell door, a bond formed between them that transcended the boundaries of their stations. Not romantic love, for Wei Chen's condition precluded such feelings, but something deeper and more profound, a recognition of shared humanity in a world that sought to strip away their individual worth and reduce them to pawns in games of power played by people who viewed lives as expendable resources. With time running desperately short and conventional channels of justice proving useless against the conspiracy's extensive reach and carefully placed bribes, Wei Chen devised a desperate plan to save Mei Lin's life that would require him to risk everything he had built over 2 decades of careful service. He would orchestrate her escape during the transport to the execution ground, using his intimate knowledge of palace security routines, the predictable patterns of guard rotations, and his network of loyal allies among the servants, guards, and minor officials who owed their positions to his patronage and protection. The plan required precise timing and absolute secrecy. A single mistake, one moment of bad luck or hesitation, would doom not only Mei Lin, but also the dozen people who had agreed to help, despite the certainty that capture would mean their own deaths by torture. Wei Chen spent his considerable personal fortune, accumulated through years of strategic investments and carefully managed corruption, to bribe key officials whose cooperation was essential to the plan's success. He called in decades of accumulated favors from people whose careers he had advanced or whose secrets he had kept, risking relationships that had taken years to cultivate and that represented his only source of power and protection in the dangerous world of imperial politics. He arranged for swift horses to be stationed at predetermined points along the escape route, their handlers paid enough to ensure their silence and cooperation even if the plan went wrong. Safe houses were established in merchant districts and rural villages, stocked with supplies and defended by men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and whose silence was guaranteed by their knowledge that betrayal would bring swift and terrible retribution. False documents were prepared that would allow Mei Lin to assume a new identity as the widow of a deceased provincial official, complete with the proper seals and signatures that would withstand casual inspection. The complexity of the operation would have impressed military strategists planning a campaign against enemy forces, but Wei Chen knew that even the most perfect plan could be undone by a moment's bad luck, a single traitor's whispered word to the wrong ears, or the simple misfortune of encountering an unexpectedly vigilant guard at the crucial moment. As the execution day dawned, with the crimson promise of sunrise painting the forbidden city's walls in shades that seemed to prophesy blood and violence, Wei Chen's carefully recruited allies began to waver under the crushing weight of their commitment and the growing realization of what failure would cost them and their families. 3 guards, who had promised to create diversions at crucial moments, suddenly claimed illness, their wives appearing at Wei Chen's residence with tearful pleas for their husband's release from their obligations, while 2 servants who were supposed to provide supplies and intelligence about patrol routes mysteriously disappeared during the night, leaving behind only hastily written notes claiming urgent family emergencies. Even his most trusted assistant, a young eunuch who had served him faithfully for 5 years and who had initially volunteered enthusiastically for the mission, began making increasingly creative excuses about conflicting duties and administrative obligations that would prevent his participation in the rescue attempt. The atmosphere of fear that surrounded high-level political conspiracies had infected everyone involved, reminding them in increasingly vivid detail that crossing powerful enemies could result in fates worse than death, torture that might last for weeks, the execution of entire families, including distant relatives, and the complete erasure of their names from official records as if they had never existed. Wei Chen found himself facing the possibility of attempting the rescue with only a handful of loyal supporters, men whose loyalty was based more on personal devotion than calculated self-interest, against the full might of the imperial security apparatus with its thousands of guards, informants, and torture specialists. The physical dangers were daunting enough, but the emotional toll of watching friends and allies abandon him in his hour of greatest need threatened to break his spirit and undermine his confidence in the righteousness of his cause. Yet each time doubt crept into his mind like poison seeping through his thoughts, he remembered Mei Lin's quiet dignity in the face of injustice, her refusal to betray innocence even when faced with the most horrible death imaginable, and his resolve hardened like steel tempered in fire and shaped by a master swordsmith's patient skill. The execution procession began at dawn, winding through the streets of the capital like a serpent of doom as curious crowds gathered along the route to witness the terrible spectacle of imperial justice, their faces displaying the mixture of fascination and revulsion that such events invariably inspired in common people who rarely saw the ultimate consequences of imperial law. Mei Lin sat in the wooden cart with her hands bound behind her back, but her head unbowed, her simple white robe marking her as one condemned to die, while her composed expression spoke of an inner peace that seemed to mystify the guards surrounding her. The cart, pulled by 2 oxen and escorted by 20 heavily armed soldiers, moved at a deliberately slow pace designed to maximize the psychological impact of the procession and to allow maximum time for the condemned to contemplate their approaching fate. Wei Chen watched from a predetermined position near the Temple of Eternal Mercy, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might betray his intentions to the guards and officials surrounding him, while his remaining allies took their positions at strategic points along the route. The signal came when the procession passed directly in front of the temple's main gate, a white dove released from the temple roof that soared briefly against the morning sky like a symbol of hope, before disappearing behind the red-tiled buildings of the old quarter. In that instant, carefully orchestrated chaos erupted as Wei Chen's remaining allies executed their desperate plan with the precision of a military operation. Smoke bombs, smuggled into position during the night and ignited by hidden Confederates, created thick clouds of confusion that made it impossible for the guards to see more than a few feet in any direction. Horses, their riders masked and anonymous, charged through the crowd, scattering spectators and soldiers alike, while additional diversions, a deliberately started fire in a nearby warehouse, a staged fight between rival merchant groups, a runaway cart loaded with pottery that shattered explosively in the street, drew attention and resources away from the main target. In the midst of the pandemonium, Wei Chen himself leaped into the cart and cut Mei Lin's bonds with a knife whose blade had been blessed by a Buddhist monk for this specific purpose, their eyes meeting for a brief moment that contained entire lifetimes of gratitude and understanding before they leapt from the cart and disappeared into the maze of narrow alleys that honeycombed the old quarter of the capital like a labyrinth designed by chaos itself. The Imperial Guard's response was swift and merciless, transforming the capital into a hunting ground where every shadow might conceal a fugitive and every citizen became a potential informant whose cooperation could be purchased with rewards or extracted through intimidation. Wei Chen and Mei Lin moved through the city like ghosts, using forgotten tunnels that dated back to the city's earliest days. Abandoned buildings that had been left empty after fires or plagues, and the networks of common people who had their own reasons to distrust imperial authority and who viewed the fugitives as symbols of resistance against the oppression they faced daily. The pursuit was relentless and professionally organized. Bloodhounds, imported from the northern provinces, traced their scent through crowded markets where merchants hawked everything from silk to exotic spices. Mounted patrols thundered through residential districts, questioning anyone who might have seen suspicious activity, and wanted posters bearing their likenesses appeared on every street corner and public building with rewards that would make a peasant family rich for several generations. They were forced to separate and reunite multiple times according to predetermined contingency plans, communicating through a system of coded messages left in specific locations, a particular arrangement of stones near a temple gate, chalk marks on designated walls, or coded phrases passed through networks of sympathetic merchants and craftsmen. Each hour brought new dangers and new evidence of the conspiracy's extensive reach, as even seemingly trustworthy allies revealed themselves to be agents of their enemies. While the city that had once been Wei Chen's familiar domain now seemed to shift and change around them like a living maze, designed specifically to trap and destroy anyone foolish enough to challenge the established order of power and privilege. As they reached the outskirts of the capital, where the great walls gave way to farmland and the roads led to distant provinces where imperial authority was less absolute and more negotiable, Wei Chen made the crushing realization that their escape had been partially anticipated by Lady Zhang's faction, who had positioned additional troops along all the major routes leading away from the city, and who had clearly been planning for this possibility from the moment their conspiracy began. To ensure Mei Lin's survival and guarantee that the evidence he had gathered would reach someone capable of acting upon it, he would have to create a diversion that would almost certainly cost him his life, but would draw pursuit away from her escape route. In a moment of profound selflessness that surprised even himself with its clarity and certainty, he revealed his true feelings. Not romantic love, for his condition had made such emotions impossible, but something deeper and more transcendent. His recognition of her worth as a human being, his admiration for her courage in the face of injustice, and his determination that such innocence should not be destroyed by the machinations of evil people who viewed others as tools to be used and discarded. He pressed into her hands the carefully documented evidence he had gathered about the conspiracy, pages of testimony from witnesses, copies of incriminating correspondence between the conspirators, and detailed records of financial transactions that proved the scope of their corruption, along with enough gold to start a new life in whatever distant province she could reach safely. He also gave her detailed instructions for reaching sanctuary in a remote mountain monastery where his cousin served as abbot, a man whose integrity was unquestioned and who would ensure that the evidence reached the emperor through channels that even Lady Zhang's influence could not corrupt. Their farewell was brief, but filled with a depth of emotion that neither had expected to experience again, a moment of perfect understanding between two souls who had found meaning in their shared commitment to justice and truth. As Wei Chen prepared to face the pursuing guards alone, drawing his sword and checking his armor one final time, Mei Lin whispered a blessing that would echo in his heart through whatever trials lay ahead. A prayer that his sacrifice would not be in vain, and that the truth would ultimately prevail against the forces of corruption and deceit. Wei Chen's last stand took place in the ruins of an ancient temple on the hillside overlooking the capital, where broken statues of forgotten gods bore silent witness to his final act of defiance against injustice, and where the crumbling stones seemed to whisper stories of other heroes who had chosen honor over survival. The temple, abandoned for generations and partially consumed by the wild growth of mountain vegetation, provided both symbolic significance and tactical advantage. Its elevated position allowed him to see his enemies approaching, while its maze of fallen pillars and collapsed walls offered opportunities for strategic defense against superior numbers. Surrounded by 30 Imperial guards, whose bronze armor gleamed in the afternoon sunlight and whose faces showed the grim determination of professional soldiers following orders they did not question, Wei Chen fought with the desperate fury of a man who had finally found his purpose in protecting innocence and defending truth against the corruption that threatened to consume everything he had once believed noble about imperial service. The battle was brief but fierce, a deadly dance of sword against spear, experience against numbers, as Wei Chen used every skill learned through decades of palace training and political survival to exact the highest possible price from his enemies. His sword, forged by master craftsmen and blessed by Taoist priests, sang through the air like a living thing as he struck down 6 guards before their companions could adjust to his speed and ferocity, while his knowledge of the temple's layout allowed him to use the terrain to his advantage, forcing his opponents into narrow passages where their superior numbers became a disadvantage. The end came when an arrow, fired by an archer positioned on a distant rooftop, found its mark between the joints of his armor and sent him to his knees among the crumbling stones where generations of pilgrims had once prayed for divine intervention. As his life ebbed away and his blood stained the ancient stones that had witnessed so much human suffering and triumph, Wei Chen felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that Mei Lin was safely away and that the evidence of the conspiracy would eventually reach ears capable of acting upon it. His last sight was of the capital spread below him like a jeweled tapestry, beautiful despite its corruption and still worthy of the sacrifice he had made, while somewhere beyond the mountains a young woman rode toward freedom, carrying the truth that would vindicate them both and perhaps inspire others to choose courage over convenience. In dying, he had finally achieved the honor that had eluded him throughout his compromised life in the imperial court, proving that even those who had been robbed of their natural manhood could still possess the greatest masculine virtue of all, the willingness to die for what is right. Months later, as autumn painted the palace gardens in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled the imperial robes themselves, the evidence that Wei Chen had gathered finally reached Emperor Xuanzong through channels that even Lady Jiang's extensive conspiracy could not control or corrupt. The revelation of the plot sent shockwaves through the court that reverberated like an earthquake through the carefully constructed hierarchies of power, resulting in executions that claimed dozens of lives, exiles that emptied entire noble families from the capital, and a purge that reshaped the balance of power within the Forbidden City so dramatically that courtiers spoke of it as the beginning of a new era in imperial politics. Lady Jiang herself, stripped of her titles and privileges in a ceremony that deliberately echoed the public humiliation she had orchestrated for others, faced the same fate she had so callously arranged for Mei Lin, though her death by 1,000 cuts was conducted with even greater deliberation and ceremony to emphasize the emperor's displeasure with those who would manipulate imperial justice for personal gain. The emperor, profoundly shaken by how close treachery had come to his throne and how easily he had been deceived by people he had trusted, issued a posthumous pardon for both Wei Chen and Mei Lin, officially acknowledging their innocence and Wei Chen's heroic sacrifice in defense of justice and imperial honor. A small shrine was erected in the palace garden where Wei Chen had often walked during his years of service, its simple inscription carved in characters that would endure for centuries. Here lies one who chose honor over survival, truth over convenience, and justice over personal safety. The irony was not lost on those who understood the true story. In a place where honor was currency and survival demanded constant compromise with moral principles, the greatest honor had ultimately belonged to a man who chose to die rather than live with injustice, and whose final act had restored some measure of integrity to an institution that had seemed beyond redemption. In a small mountain village, far from the intrigues of the imperial court, where the air was clean and the rhythms of life followed the seasons rather than the whims of emperors and courtiers, a young woman, known as Lin Mei, ran a school for peasant children, teaching them to read and write with the same patience and dedication that had once marked her service in the palace. The village, nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered peaks that seemed to touch the heavens themselves, had welcomed her as a widow seeking refuge from the sorrows of the capital, and few questioned her story or suspected that the gentle teacher who instructed their children in virtue and learning had once been condemned to death by imperial decree. Her school, built with her own hands and the help of grateful parents, occupied a simple building of wood and paper that seemed to glow with warmth and learning, while her teaching methods, influenced by the Confucian classics but tempered by Buddhist compassion, produced students who were not only literate but wise beyond their years. She never married, dedicating her life instead to the education and welfare of others, as if seeking to repay the debt she owed to the man who had sacrificed everything for her freedom and whose memory had become the guiding principle of her new existence. On quiet evenings, when the mountain mist gathered around her simple home like the breath of sleeping dragons, she would light incense before a small altar bearing Wei Chen's name, written in characters she had painted with her own hand, and speak to him as if he were present, sharing the joys and sorrows of her new life and asking for his guidance in difficult decisions. The children she taught grew up to become scholars, merchants, officials, and craftsmen who carried forward the values of justice and compassion that she instilled in them through stories that never mentioned their true source, creating ripples of goodness that spread far beyond the mountain village, and perhaps in some small way helped to heal the wounds that corruption and injustice had inflicted upon the empire itself. In this way, Wei Chen's sacrifice continued to bear fruit long after his death, proving that a single act of courage and selflessness could create changes that echoed through generations, transforming not only individual lives but the very fabric of society in ways that even the most powerful emperors could rarely achieve through all their wealth and authority.